Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and I want to talk about a topic I've become surprisingly involved in over the last few years, which is the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland Statement, otherwise called GERS. Now, the reason why it's slightly surprising that I'm involved in it is that, as you'll note, I've got an Irish name and I've definitely got an English accent, and as far as I know, I've got absolutely no Scottish blood in me at all, and I've never lived there. And yet, this issue about the credibility of that statement is one that over the last few years I've become quite heavily involved with, because I think that that statement, the GERS statement, is what I have come to describe as crap. Now, crap in this context means a completely rubbish approximation to the truth. So C.R.A.P. Now, why is it a completely rubbish approximation to the truth, and why does that matter? GERS is published by the Scottish Government every year in August, always at the same time, towards the end of August, to the extent that it's even now called GERS Day in Scotland. And it always gives rise to an enormous debate, to an extent that nothing equivalent in the rest of the UK does. Why is that? Because, well, Scotland is divided between nationalists who want Scottish independence, now a majority it would seem, and unionists who want to remain part of the UK. And the argument is that GERS does every year prove that Scotland could not survive as an independent state. I disagree, because I think the figures are, as I say, crap, completely rubbish approximations to the truth, and even fundamentally technically flawed. This year's GERS statement showed that according to this data, Scotland had a deficit of, on its government account, of 8.6%. Now, first of all, that's false in itself, because the Scottish Government actually balanced its books. It's legally required to do so. So it gives us the first clue as to what the problem about this statement that Scotland has such a large deficit is, which is that 40% of the expenditure that is reflected in that statement is in fact incurred for Scotland, but not by Scotland. In other words, it's spent by the UK government, and by no means necessarily all in Scotland. Just to make the position clear, Scotland is recharged with expenses of literally running Westminster. It's charged with expenses of running a defence system, which by no means is all based in Scotland and is not necessarily what Scotland would want to have. It's charged with the national debt, or its share of the interest cost on the national debt. And yet it's debatable as to how much of that national debt is really attributable to Scotland, when of course it's now widely recognised that Scotland ran a surplus on its own trading for many decades because of oil. So these numbers that are charged to Scotland aren't necessarily in any way appropriate, or certainly an indication of what Scotland would spend if it was independent. But there are also a whole load of other approximations. Now, when I first looked at this estimate, very little of the tax revenue could be attributed to Scotland. That situation has changed now. At one time it was just virtually local government income that we could say was safely and certainly earned in Scotland. Well, there is now a Scottish tax system and a Scottish Revenue Authority, Revenue Scotland. So income tax payers in Scotland are now identifiable, and by and large national insurance payers are as well, and indeed we can be fairly confident that those sums are properly declared. There's a reasonable probability that the VAT figures for Scotland might be properly prepared as well on the basis of surveys of consumption inside Scotland. But there are still some major holes in the income statement for Scotland, and things that we don't know. For example, we simply don't know what the imports and exports of Scotland are, but they have a significant impact upon how much VAT should be declared in the country. We have no clue what corporate profits in Scotland really are. That just has to be guessed. There is no apportionment of capital gains tax on any reasonable basis, because we can't be sure that the capital gains are necessarily declared in the right country, and so on, because these figures are not devolved to Scotland. So the estimates are enormous. But even if the estimates were right, there are things that are wrong about the statement. The statement reflects government income in Scotland, but expenditure for Scotland. They're not the same thing, of course. They're not government expenditure for Scotland, their government expenditure in the whole of the UK, which is deemed by London to be for the benefit of Scotland. So this isn't a Scottish statement on the expenditure side. It's a UK statement on the expenditure side, which has dumped part of its costs onto Scotland, whether appropriately or not. And the income side does not include the tax paid on that expenditure by the UK government, which is outside Scotland, but which is claimed to be for the benefit of Scotland. In other words, the income side is automatically understated as a result. In fact, even if, in theory, the income and expenditure were the same, they couldn't be, because the tax is not credited to Scotland on all the expenditure. And whenever the government spends, of course, it does become somebody's income, so tax is paid, and that's why that's important. So this system is designed not to balance, and it's designed not to balance in the rest of the UK's benefit and to Scotland's cost. And the result is that Scotland is reported as having a deficit in the year 2019-20 of 8.6% of its total income. There's no other country, no other region in Europe which has an equivalent accounting exercise undertaken for it, which has a deficit like that. The worst member of the EU is Romania in this sense, and it has a deficit of 4.3%, half of that of Scotland. Countries like Denmark, which are almost the same size and in some ways have the same advantages and disadvantages as Scotland, have a surplus in the year. So there's no reason why Scotland is in this situation. The statement simply doesn't reflect the reality of Scotland's situation. Now, I can't tell you what the right number is, because the data isn't collected to tell you the right number. But I can tell you that the data is biased, for all the reasons I've already noted, that the income is understated, the expenditure is overstated, and as a consequence the deficit is definitely too high. I wish the Scottish Government would try to get the data to be better. I wish the government in the UK would try to collect the data that is required for the Scottish Government to get it better. But most of all, I wish the UK government would stop dumping costs on Scotland which have nothing to do with it, and which it wouldn't incur of its own free will, and which are completely inappropriate for inclusion in this statement as a result, because they reflect the decisions of London and not any decision that Scotland has or ever will make. So GERS is political. It's not a true statement of account. It's a choice to present a particular view of Scotland, and we know that's true. This statement was first created by a Tory Secretary of State for Scotland in 1992, Ian Lang, and he intended that it showed that Scotland could never be independent. It still is political. It's a lot better now than it was when he created it. I do not deny that it has improved in quality, but it's still a politically biased and even rigged statement to make sure that a particular view is presented by data that is chosen for its inappropriateness to answer the question, which is, what is Scotland's true deficit? It gives no clue what Scotland's deficit would be if it was independent, but even what is Scotland's deficit now? It's simply overstated, it's wrong, it's crap, and frankly, it should be consigned to the bin. I'm Richard Murphy, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this video series on YouTube if you're interested. Also look for us on Facebook. I am on Twitter, @RichardJMurphy, and at the same time look at my blog, Tax Research UK, where you can find much more on these themes. And I'll see you again soon.